Yes, so welcome back. I'm delighted to be joined by Nina Schick, who is the author of Deepfakes and Infocalypse, What You Urgently Need to Know. So, Nina, thank you very much for your time. What exactly are deepfakes to start with?
A deepfake is essentially a piece of synthetic media. That's to say an image, a piece of audio, a piece of video, or even text that's either generated wholly or partly by AI. And the ability of AI to generate actual fake synthetic media is something that's only really been around for about 2.5 years, and we trace back to the kind of revolution in deep learning over the last 5 years. So this is something that's really, really cutting edge, really new, but essentially a fake piece of media made by AI. And given how bad we've been dealing with our crisis of disinformation over the last 10 years, deepfakes potentially have the potential to wreak havoc upon society.
I was looking at some deepfakes before I did this interview, and it was terrifying how good some of them are. I saw one from the film Solo, which is like a Star Wars knockoff, where they kind of got Han Solo as an actor who is, I can't remember who the actor is, but they kind of merged two actors together, and it was really impressive. I mean, how much of a kind of threat is this to, the running of our democracy almost?
Well, the first thing I would say is that we are increasingly facing a future where media and content production is going to be made by AI. So the future is completely synthetic. Some experts who I think, who I interviewed for my book, say that within 5 to 7 years' time, 90% of video content online is going to be synthetic. That isn't all going to be used for bad things. There's going to be very practical, kind of viable commercial applications of synthetic media. For one, movies are going to become incredible. So are video games. The future of fashion, the future of content production, the future of media is completely going to be changed by AI. But the thing about building this cool technology, as kind of the last few decades should have shown us, is that every time you build this amazing technology which can do incredible things, for creativity or communication, it is also naturally going to be used as a weapon. So it is going to be the most sophisticated piece of disinformation, a tool of disinformation known to humanity thus far, because essentially you're going to take Hollywood level special effects, whether that's in a piece of audio, in a piece of film, something which previously, until only about 4 years ago, would have only been accessible to somebody who had teams of special effects artists, a multi-million-dollar budget, and you're democratizing it through AI to the point where anybody can make that kind of content. So you are looking, of course, when it comes to the political application of this, of course, it is going to be used as a tool of political propaganda, because the AI can be used in a way that it can be trained on your biometrics. So if I have a clip of your voice, if I have a few images of your digital likeness, I can train the AI to look and sound and act like you in video or in audio. So it can be used, of course, as a tool of political propaganda. But the other thing about deepfakes that's really important to politics is that in a world where anything can be faked, right, including video of you saying and doing things that you never did, everything can be denied. And that is actually, I think, the first kind of negative impact, adverse impact we're going to see in terms of politics before synthetic media and deepfakes even become ubiquitous, because you're already starting to see that, where people are, authentic evidence is emerging of them having or said or done something, and it's being dismissed as a deepfake. So essentially, deepfakes are a threat to liberal democracy, because if you have no objective sense of what's real or not, it's very difficult to see how that isn't an existential threat to a liberal democracy. Great for authoritarians, very bad for democracy.
I mean, is there any kind of evidence of deepfakes being actually created and used for political purposes so far?
Yeah, so the first use case of deepfakes, and I should point out, first of all, again, just how pioneering this is. This has only been around for about 2.5 years. So the first use case, perhaps unsurprisingly, of deepfakes, very malicious, is non-consensual pornography. And it actually started on Reddit 2.5 years ago, where an anonymous user kind of took these open source tools that were just coming out of the AI research community and realized he could use them to train kind of AI to appropriate someone's digital likeness, and he did it to make fake porn videos of celebrities. Porn is pioneering, and of course it is now starting to leach out into politics.
Yeah.
Not as widespread as in pornography yet, and that's because right now I would say the technology, although it's improving rapidly, there's still some barriers to entry. So when you see kind of the headlines, a lot of them have been around deepfakes saying, oh my God, this is the end of democracy and all politicians will be slandered by deepfakes. I would say that actually we haven't seen that many use cases in politics yet, but I think that is just a matter of time. As I already mentioned, I think the first impact will be this thing called the liar's dividend, where authentic evidence will be dismissed as fake. But there have been some use cases. For example, I mean, earlier this year, Extinction Rebellion, the controversial group, took a speech by the Belgian Prime Minister, Sophie Wilmès, and they manipulated it with AI using deepfake technology to make her deliver a speech that she never made, in which she linked SARS, Ebola, and COVID, all of these recent pandemics, to ecological destruction. And it's really convincing. So it's only a matter of time, really, until it starts leaching into politics. We're starting to see that happening now.
I mean, is there going to be almost like an arms race between people trying to develop these things and people trying to develop alternative software to kind of identify them? So I presume it'll get so advanced that basically we won't be able to tell the difference. But have to be an algorithm fighting an algorithm. I may be wrong.
Yeah, no, that is. So one part of the solution is absolutely to develop the software led by AI to detect the deepfakes, because they are going to be so widespread that it's not going to be possible for any kind of human to tell what media is synthetic and what media is not. It's just too mammoth of a task. And even if you did hypothetically have enough humans to sit there and look through every piece of content that was uploaded online to make a judgment as to whether it was synthetic or not, the AI is developing and accelerating at such a rate that to the naked human eye, any kind of forensic techniques that we might use now to distinguish if something is a deepfake is just not going to be possible anymore, because they are literally going to become perfect. So human eye won't be able to tell, and they'll be so ubiquitous that it's too vast of a task for any kind of human to try and detect. So you need to then develop AI to basically try and detect in the DNA of media whether it's synthetic or not. The problem with that is that the kind of AI networks behind the generation of deepfakes, every time you build a detector, that can be used to train an AI to build a better generator. So every time you build a defense, you're potentially making an even better kind of deception tool. So you're in this constant, like you said, an arms race, a kind of cat and mouse game, where every time you build a detector, the generator gets better, and so on and so forth. And the kind of question that the jury is still out on, the kind of AI research community doesn't have an answer to this yet, and I guess we'll see over the next few years, is there a point where the generating AI gets so good that even a detector can't detect within the DNA of that piece of media that's actually synthetic? And we don't know the answer to that yet. So, but until then, it's going to be this cat and mouse game.
I mean, in terms of kind of positive uses, I mean, the two that kind of spring to mind for me are, I guess you could perhaps have people almost inputting in their own personal films. So you can have a movie and you become the main character in the movie. And the same with video games. I don't know if that'd be possible. If there are any other kind of major positive uses that I'm missing.
Yeah, no, there are going to be so many commercially viable and legitimate uses of synthetic media. And because this field is still so new, the taxonomy hasn't really been decided. And that's why in my book, I kind of distinguish between synthetic media, which is basically any media that's generated by AI, which can be used for really legitimate purposes, versus deepfakes. And deepfakes is what I call when synthetic media is being used for the purposes of mis or disinformation. So when it comes to synthetic media and legitimate applications, Absolutely. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of ways in which this is not only going to be used in a legitimate way, but it's actually going to reshape entire industries. So for one, if you think about corporate communications, the fact that, let's say you're the CEO of a company and you can just you work with a synthetic media company, upload kind of your digital likeness, you can give them a script, and then they can generate a video of you talking in, 27 different languages, communicating to different markets. The same for kind of any kind of educational material. The same for video games, where you can have like your own AI avatar projected into the video game. Basically, it is a real plus for content creators. Any YouTuber will have the ability to generate what a Hollywood studio can only do now. And a really good way to kind of see the power of synthetic media is to look at some of the early kind of deepfake they call themselves deepfake creators, who are on YouTube. So, for example, there's this one guy called iFake who has taken Martin Scorsese's film The Irishman, which he spent, over 7 years working on, and spent millions of dollars on kind of the de-aging software and a 3-rig camera to kind of have this effect where his protagonists are getting look younger and then older in the film. And iFake, who is one YouTuber using kind of free AI software, kind of tries to de-age Scorsese's main protagonist, and his effect is arguably better than what Scorsese managed to achieve. So it is a real boon for content creators, for the creative industries. However, again, as I say, that technology will also obviously be used by bad actors.
Yeah. I mean, is there like a sort of an active community of deepfake creators, or is it very much kind of different individuals being entirely autonomous?
No, I think there is. I think it's both. So first of all, the first application of deepfakes, as I already mentioned, is in this non-consensual pornography. And non-consensual deepfake pornography has already spawned its own kind of ecosystem online, which is very interconnected. There are, it's becoming increasingly commodified. There are special deepfake porn creators who you can commission for your kind of bespoke creations, but they're also interconnected in the sense that right now the main creation tools are free kind of software platforms, which are run by some anonymous kind of deepfake gurus, so to speak. So that is pretty cogent and connected, and there's like several websites where most of the deepfake pornography online is hosted on. Very easy to find. But increasingly, you do have entrepreneurial kind of individuals who are teaching themselves how to use kind of the deepfake software, which is already available, and there'll be more and more of that as the kind of generation side improves. And you see them advertising their services on LinkedIn and online, selling deepfake training tutorials on Instagram, because I think they're starting to see that aside from porn, there's many people who kind of want to have like the ability to put their face in a film, make themselves the protagonist of a film. So yeah, you're starting to see both a kind of connected community as well as kind of entrepreneurial individuals who are seizing on kind of this age of synthetic media as the next kind of big thing to come in the content creation industries.
I mean, you kind of alluded to this because you're going to make a big change. I mean, I don't know if you've been speaking to lots of policymakers and journalists, or do people really be affected by this? Do you think people know what's coming?
No. No. And this is actually why I wrote my book, because my background is in politics and geopolitics, and increasingly witnessing how the huge changes in the architecture of our information ecosystem have led to a crisis in disinformation and misinformation. Although disinformation has existed since time immemorial, I argue that the levels of bad information that we're seeing right now are unprecedented and are connected to kind of the huge changes in our information ecosystem, primarily being the internet, the advent of the smartphone, social media, and increasingly the age of coming synthetic media. All of these technologies, all of these breakthroughs are not bad per se, but these technologies are an amplifier of human intention. So even though they've given us some tremendous benefits, we've been too slow to gauge how they can also be used by bad actors, or how they can just be used, even if there's no bad intent, to spread bad information, right? So when it comes to deep fakes, absolutely not. I think there is still a low understanding amongst policymakers, politicians, even journalists, as to how potent this technology is and what it means for them. So the reason why I wrote the book is to kind of conceptualize deepfakes as the latest evolving threat in, I believe, is something our corroding information ecosystem. And then only once you've kind of put a conceptual wrapper around all of this and begin to understand how AI is just, again, not in a vacuum, but the next evolving trend, can you begin to think about solutions? Like, how do we deal with this? Because it's something that affects society universally.
Yeah, I mean, I know you've done a lot of work in Ukraine and Russia. And I think you mentioned once that you were being interviewed by, or I think alongside, a kind of a Putin apologist, and you just had no kind of common basis. I think this is how your book starts. No common basis in truth. And obviously, at the moment, we can be fairly confident, or up until very recently, we can be fairly confident that videos were real, even if photographs could be photoshopped. I mean, so this is going to take it one step further. There's going to be, even audio and video, the average human being just won't be able to trust in a way that we can still just about now.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I find deepfakes so scary, because they're emerging at a time when video is becoming the most important medium of human communication, right? And that is, one, because we're psychologically wired to look at visual information that looks right and want to believe it. Psychologists call that processing fluency, and we're far more likely to do it with audiovisual evidence or something audiovisual rather than text, for example. You're absolutely right that images, the manipulation of images has been around for a lot longer, but the manipulation of sophisticated audiovisual content in video or audio format has traditionally been something that's, to do well, you would need a lot of resources, right? So I keep saying a Hollywood studio or somebody with kind of a lot of money and special effects artists. So when you have two things happening right now. One, the manipulation of this, so the creation of this highly sophisticated kind of fake content is going to become available to everyone. And this is happening at a time when this information ecosystem, which is connected to the advent of the internet, the smartphone, social media, so kind of at the turn of the century, when everybody in the world is going to be plugged into it, right? 80% of online traffic next year is going to be driven by video uploads and downloads. And it is half of the world which is already connected into this information ecosystem have been really bad at dealing with the forebear of deepfakes, so-called cheap fakes, any kind of audiovisual material that's manipulated either by like editing. It's nothing to do with AI, right? So this is, cheap fakes are even before AI. So we've been really, really bad at dealing with that. So every indicator suggests that when the manipulations become easier, more widespread, and more sophisticated, there is no way we're ready for that yet. And the second thing that really worries me is that the other half of the world, which isn't plugged into this information ecosystem yet, is going to join over the next decade. And they are people who are kind of in the developing world who have even less kind of digital literacy than the people in the West do. I mean, I see this, I'm half Nepalese. I see this when I go back to Nepal, where people who have no access to running water, sanitation, have a smartphone and can plug into the internet, and therefore are even more vulnerable to kind of manipulations like this online. So I'm very, very worried that when video is becoming the single most important medium of human communication, when humans are all consumers of video almost universally over the next decade, 100% of the global population almost is going to be consuming this video, but not only consuming it, but producing it too, and uploading it and sharing it. just at this time, AI is going to subvert video in terms of being able to fake it in this very sophisticated way. And I don't think we're ready for that. So the kind of consequences of that are, well, like I say, universal and affect every part of the world.
I mean, do you think there's a link between what appears to be kind of becoming easier to spread fake information? So I guess social media being a big part of that, and what seems to be kind of a rise in political authoritarianism. So, you know, all the way from the United States to Brazil to the Philippines to parts of Europe, there seems to be more kind of aggressive, generally nationalist authoritarian, but not always nationalist authoritarian, but certainly generally authoritarian regimes forming. I mean, do you think those two things are connected?
I would say that they are connected in the sense that this kind of revival of authoritarianism is in its current iteration, right, as we see it manifesting in the 21st century, is something which the information ecosystem, or the corrosion of the information ecosystem, is helping to shore up, right? Because if you're an authoritarian regime, one thing that is absolutely fundamental to your tyranny and rule is being able to control the narrative, right? If you, as an authoritarian regime, can control the information or delegitimize every bit of information that is against your regime that you don't like, then this corroded information ecosystem is going to be something that's a very powerful weapon. And in my book, I kind of start with Russia because my career started with about 10 years ago, looking at what Russia did in Eastern Ukraine when it invaded Eastern Ukraine and then annexed Crimea. And what was very interesting to me was, even though the strategy wasn't new per se, the tools of the new information ecosystem were far more potent. And Russia, in its authoritarian kind of manner, seized upon this new information ecosystem in a way that was very entrepreneurial. Again, strategy was the same, to kind of undermine the West and ballast its own narrative at home and in the region. But it was so powerful in its use of social media, the internet, to spread these narratives not only at home but abroad. So a lot of the kind of 21st century authoritarians that we're seeing on the rise, I think you can directly track how they're using the tools of this information ecosystem to shore up their power.
Yeah. I mean, do you think in the future authoritarian government, I mean, this is kind of more a general AI question, but as AI advances, could authoritarian governments increasingly use AI to make governmental decisions? So obviously you can slowly cut out humans out of the conversation. And once you cut humans out of the conversation, there's no real way to remove the authoritarian regime.
Absolutely. I mean, you already kind of see the forebears to that in what China is doing. You know, China is kind of almost developing this techno-authoritarian state, not only when it comes to surveillance, but also, I'm sure, in more and more increasingly so in terms of decision making. So yeah, I actually think you may see this happening in the West as well, in the sense that you have new arbiters of power who aren't necessarily the state, but, you know, private companies. So basically, who are the vested interests or the groups or the people who control the architecture of the new information ecosystem? And in the West, you know, the social media companies and the big tech platforms have a tremendous amount of power. So just as in China, you might see the state, which has the power there, develop a kind of new techno-authoritarian regime. In the West, it may be also a type of authoritarianism, because these people who control the information ecosystem have a tremendous amount of power and are not responsible or answerable to us as voters. So I think you might see it develop in different ways in different parts of the world, but almost certainly I think it will be used as a tool of authoritarianism.
Yeah, I want to turn very quickly to the United States, both because I know you've done quite a lot of work on you're saying on Ukraine, and kind of how a country can disintegrate into conflict. And obviously, it's very relevant to the kind of fake news debate. But in America at the moment looks incredibly politically charged. You've obviously got a president who's refusing to say that he'll concede. I mean, he's already pumping out rubbish about electoral frauds. You've got armed groups on both sides on the streets. And I think just in the last couple of weeks, I think people on both sides have been killed by the other armed groups. I mean, how worried are you about the direction America's heading in? Is it a real pressure cooker, do you think?
I'm very worried, not only worried for the United States, but worried for what it means for the rest of the Western world, because love or hate America, and it does have its political problems, no doubt. But if you believe in kind of liberal democracy and the Western world being a beacon for those kind of liberal values, the truth is that without the United States kind of allied to the other Western countries, then there is less and less of a chance of those ideals surviving. And we've already seen the decline of kind of the liberal Western model over the last 2 decades. Yeah. And this election, I think, is a watershed moment. In my book, I talk about our crisis of disinformation, and I focus on foreign actors like Russia and increasingly China, and how they infiltrate Western information spaces to spread disinformation. But the second part of my book is really looking at Western democracies themselves, and in particular the United States, because you can't talk about the corrosion of our information ecosystem and disinformation without addressing the fact that we suffer from a huge crisis of homegrown disinformation. And the United States is almost the most extreme example of that, because you have somebody in the White House who is the president and also the leader of the free world, who is arguably one of the most powerful purveyors of disinformation in the world, right? And he's used this new information ecosystem, his use of social media, for example, his use of manipulated media, his platform, as an influencer, to tremendous effect, not only in the United States, but across the world. So in a way, what happens at the election is kind of the short or medium term concern, because if Trump loses, and he doesn't lose by a significant margin, every indicator suggests that he is going to contest that result. Even if he is removed from the White House by the Secret Service, because they presumably will do so if he refuses to concede defeat, it's already happening. There are already armed vigilantes on the streets, and you can see how that will escalate further in the event that Trump calls upon all his supporters to kind of take to the streets because his election victory has been robbed from him. Hypothetically, let's say that Biden wins and Trump goes quietly. I still think the problem of the actual corroding information ecosystem is something that, Biden victory isn't necessarily going to stem. After the debate has become so polarized and so divisive, and you're at this point where literally, as you mentioned, people on both sides are parading the streets and killing each other. This is happening in America in 2020. How do you come back from that precipice? So whatever happens, I'm very concerned about the state of American democracy, whoever wins. And I think the only way is if cooler heads kind of try to prevail and try to unite the country a little bit more going forward. But given how heated the partisanship has already become, it's difficult to see that happening.
Yeah. I mean, just one final very quick question. In terms of the solution to the problem, is there anything that can be done about it? Can, some sort of mass, what's the word I'm looking for, censorship, in some way improve the situation? Or is technology so far gone that there's really nothing we can do and we just have to learn to live with it?
We absolutely can do something. And that's why I wrote the book, because I think the first thing to do is just to understand, right? In this instance, knowledge is power. It really is. So to kind of put a conceptual wrapper around how is fake news connected to AI-generated porn, connected to the American election, connected to Chinese disinformation campaigns on COVID. Well, it's all connected because they're all existing in this increasingly dangerous information ecosystem. So once you actually see that conceptually, then you can focus on fixing the architecture of the actual information ecosystem rather than getting lost in its kind of divisive and polarizing currents. In terms of solutions, there's kind of 2 broad categories. The first is the technical solutions. So doing things like building the AI software to detect fakes, which is going to become necessary as they become ubiquitous and they become undiscernible to the human eye, but also doing things like embedding into the software of devices, whether that's a phone or a camera, authenticity. So almost like a watermark that if you're a journalist, for example, so, you know, this might be increasingly important for you to prove that this interview legitimately happened. It's not fake media. This is an authentic piece of media. It's an authentic piece of content. But then the second set of solutions, and this is where it's far more complicated, and this is where ultimately, like I say, this problem is something that is about humanity, not about technology. Technology is an amplifier of human intention, but we don't have sentient AI creating disinformation yet. So until we get to that point, it's still primarily a human problem. So you have to think about building society-wide resilience, because you can build the best kind of technical tools and defenses, but until society, first of all, accepts that this is a problem and wants to do something about it, nothing is going to happen. And you need a networked approach there where you work with legislators, civil society, technologists to kind of make this a priority and then focus on the various kind of digital education, policy, legislative tools, because I would love to say there's one thing you need to do, but there is no one silver bullet answer. It happens at a level where kind of it encompasses all of society, and consequently the solutions also, you need a wide berth of solutions.
Yeah, well, Nina, it's been a real pleasure. Slightly troubling at points, but I think that's the point. But yeah, I'll put a link in the description to where people can buy your books if they want to. But no, thank you very much for your time. I'm very grateful.
Thank you. Good to speak to you.
Thank you.